and we can sort of start. So just as a brief reminder, midnight Friday. Everything needs to be in midnight Friday. All your modules, all your module work, your quizzes and exams need to be in um, by Friday. So make sure you're going through and doing each portion and doing each one of the interactive tasks in the modules themselves. Hopefully you're getting some good things from your modules. I'm excited for some of your interactive tasks for your elements today with CBT. If you haven't already done that one, you get to listen to a pretty cool podcast, I think called Screaming into the Void, that gets to talk about how concepts of conditioning, which are really cool. We'll touch base on a little bit of that today. But make sure you get all that done Friday, midnight. Saturday morning, I'll be waking up and taking care of grades and getting all that posted and submitted Saturday. So anyway, we'll go there. So jumping into kind of where we transitioned from last time. I think I'd mentioned in our last sort of class that we're in a time frame in the present theories. So psychoanalytic with Freud, Adler, even existentialism, Gestalt, which we'll talk about, Rogerian therapy, fast forwarding to behavioral therapy, CBT, and even family systems. We kind of are in a period of modernism, which accepts the idea that there's sort of universal truth, right? That we're looking for something that is universal amongst an experience. And when we have that, that also gives us sort of a universal like approach to dealing with something, right? In medicine, we may have more of this concept that we sort of talk about, which is, hey, there's a specific pathology to that runny nose, that fever, that cough that you have, right? And so you go to your doctor, and your doctor says, "Oh, that is a bacterial infection, or that is a virus," right? Typically, they're going to say it's some sort of virus, not a bacterial infection necessarily, but they'll say it's a virus, right? And then there's various forms of a virus. And so then they give you medication to attack that is an antiviral medication. This is concepts of modernism, right? That there is something that is meaningful going on, and we can pinpoint it and we can figure it out, and then we can give you something that can help with that. And that's what really all these theories are dealing with, right? Later this week, you're going to get into some postmodernist approaches that that have come and that now exist: narrative therapy, solution-focused therapy, feminist family therapy. This is not feminist theory. This is feminist family therapy, is what you're talking about in these models. So if you are really familiar with feminist theory, this is not necessarily going to tie in completely or mirror everything in terms of feminist theory. It's feminist family therapy, which is a slight variation of or adaptation of feminist theory, right? There's from feminist theory has grown lots of variations of feminist approaches. So with that narrative, solution focused, strategic family therapy, these types of approaches you're going to get into later are much more of a postmodernist standpoint. And a postmodernist says that there is really no universal truth, right? Take some of the things that we're going to talk about today, which is concepts like you create, like your interactions with the world around you create truth, and then build on that and modify that to mean anything you want can exist. Like anything that you think exists, right? There's no universal concept any longer in terms of postmodern thought. And maybe a more extreme version of that would be I look out my window and I see something that I call the sun, and it is the sun and it exists and it's the sun, right? But you may call it something else, and it is not necessarily the sun, right? That would be more of a postmodernist. So narrative and solution focus are really focused on and emphasize those concepts, which is that there's nothing universal in the experience. It is your experience that then brings about change from how you create narratives within your experience or how you see the world. Um, and so that's kind of the tail end of what you're going to get at the end of this week. We'll back up a bit and jump into some more interesting pieces. So I wanted to not talk a ton about Gestalt theory last time because I wanted you to kind of get into the model and even watch Fritz Perls do some of the therapy. And for you probably to be highly offended by a number of things within those video interactions, which is the predominant experience that people have, is they feel it's very abrasive. Most people focus on he's attacking her or he's provoking her or he is doing things that are not within the current culture, which we live in a very postmodernist experience that we really care for or like. I will say one thing, which is present day Gestalt therapists don't practice in the exact same way that Fritz Perls do or did, right? His unique style and personality were a little bit more germane to the time in which he functioned and practiced. You can find lots of present day Gestalt approaches that feel more collaborative. I think that that's the nature of most people's reflection, is that they want something that's a little bit more collaborative, and he does not necessarily feel very collaborative in what he's doing. It feels like he's forcing something. But if you go back and watch, because I think most of the time when you're watching a video like that, we are responsive and we are conditioned in our responses to the salacious, to the emotionally intense. And that's what you're going to get from the CBT and the behavioral therapy approaches as you go through those soon. Negative. So for example, negative headlines really get exponentially more clicks than positive, right? If I put up 2 headlines and one was like something about like dog finds its way home versus some salacious dog experience, like more people are going to click on the dog, on the like salacious negative type of dog experience than they are that, right? We are just attuned to emotion. So when we watch something like Fritz Perls and Gloria, most of the time we are responding because we're putting ourselves in the shoes of Gloria rather than we're putting ourselves in the shoes of the clinician. And so if you were to go back and watch it and watch specifically what Fritz Perls is trying to do, there's some actual pretty interesting, I don't want to call it genius, I don't want to offend anybody, but there's some really interesting pieces that Fritz Perls brings about. One of the really interesting changes that he brought about was up until the time of Gestalt, most of the time we're talking about psychotherapy, we're talking about going backwards in people's experience, right? We talk about Freud was all about your past, early development, critical stages of development. We talk about Adler, and it's even like, okay, how did you develop as a kid in your sibling relationships and what impacted you in the past sort of idea. Existentialism was still this, hey, here's this past and future concept, but there's not a lot of like present conceptualization. And so Fritz Perls comes along and really introduces a revolutionary concept, which is that now is the time in which we have most power. Now is the time when we can change things. We can't really change things of the past. And for many of you, you may go, oh, that makes sense, right? I know I can't change my past. And we say it all the time. if I had a nickel for every time a client said that in therapy, like, I know I can't change my past. But then they proceed to either try and change the past, or they stay sitting in the past and they only talk about the past, and they act as if the past had so much more weight and so much more influence over them than what the present experience of the past has, right? And so Gestalt therapy, or Fritz Perls, was all about, your present moment is when you become the most empowered. And so as you watch him with Gloria, for example, all of his techniques, right? Emphasizing the wagging finger, her shaking leg, her mannerisms, aren't to sort of call her out, but is to bring her to a present sense of self. That all these things that she may have talked about or experienced in her past are really much of a present day expression. And in present day, she is not who she once was. And so you hear him talk about, are you the little girl in the corner? Are you the little girl in the corner? Are you that little girl, right? And you walk in here and you make me into a bad guy and you make me into whatever, and that's not real for you. He calls it phony, but he says that's not real. People often get offended by the phony terminology, but he's saying that's not the real you, right? You are strong, you're powerful, you're not the same little girl in the corner that needs someone to bring her out, right? Uh, you are, you don't need all that. You have the ability to change things and to have power over your your experience, over everything that's going on for you, more than you think you do. And he does that by bringing her to a present, right? Because in her past she can't do that, and if she's so focused on the future, then anxiety will kick in and she'll have some sort of angst and won't be able to control that either. And so he introduces something which is be present, right? And from Gestalt we get all kinds of even modern day presence exercises, right? Meditation, mindfulness, right? So much of those sorts of concepts are influenced by the idea of what Fritz Perls was trying to do early on in his work, and became really, really fascinating part of his experience. um, if you have any questions, and I know we're a smaller group today, but if you have any questions about any of these things at any time, you can pipe in or raise your hand or put something in the chat. You don't have to just sort of sit and listen. So if you have questions, please let me know, so that we can make sure that we address those.
I know in the social work podcast they had mentioned that kind of to save Gestalt therapy, they had to move away from that sort of confrontational like nature. Do you have like an example of how it's changed like for modern day versus like what we watched with Fritz Perls?
Um, yes, there is, in the slides, at the end of the slides, there should be on the very last slide, there should be one that says a modern example, and then has an empty chair technique as well. And those are two videos on YouTube that you can go watch that are a little bit more like collaborative in nature. They really walk the individual into like a description of the technique and what's going to happen, so that the individual doesn't feel like, hey, you're just doing something to me that I'm not sort of recognizing. People sort of bristle at that. They don't want just things to be done. So that's what I would probably point you to in terms of a modern day example. Maybe that would help you.
Do you think that the like power dynamic of him being a man with a PhD and her being a woman in that time period had an effect on their interaction?
Um, are you asking me in my modern day lens, in my postmodern day lens of power, if I think that influenced modernism?
I'm sorry, I didn't word this correctly. Cycling back to Gloria and Fritz Perls, like, do you think that do you think she would have been more comfortable if there was like a woman working with her? Or like, I don't know, because I noticed one of the like big limitations is that there is this weird kind of like white coat syndrome, like power thing of like, I don't know where I'm going with this. You can disregard.
No, it's a good question. So your question is, and the reason why I rephrased it back to you in the way I asked it was because you're asking a postmodern question in a modernist time frame. And so you're taking what we view as really impactful or meaningful, right? Like today we would say, yeah, male female dynamics, white coat syndrome. We would take all that language and we would package that and say, oh, for sure that had an influence on Gloria, right? But we may also be negating two variables, which is one is there was no differential at the time, right? Like this is how medicine or psychotherapy was administered. And so there wasn't an assumption of, hey, I'm going to feel super comfortable and warm and inviting and I'm looking for and not to say that if you're not looking for it, if you're not aware of it, that doesn't also exist. Again, that's another postmodernism concept, but there was almost an assumption of this is the way it goes, right? And we still see effects of that today. I mentioned in the last lecture, like you go into your doctor and your doctor says, hey, why don't you strip down, take off your pants and put on these like paper underwear so I can examine you. And you're like, oh, okay. And you like do it because there's sort of a assumed hierarchy of knowledge, of understanding. It's a little bit more blurred along the lines because we have WebMD, and so people try and research their own conditions and walk in with their own knowledge sometimes. But at that time, that was a big part of it. The other piece that we may be negating by asking that type of question is that the functionality of that was purposeful or meaningful. Just as we said, Freud with, because I think Paige, maybe it wasn't you, maybe you asked about transference and countertransference. Was that you that asked about that?
It was me. I'm
Okay.
sure everyone's sick of my voice by now.
No, you're doing great. I love your questions. So with those concepts, it was you're using what is available to you, right? And so what we see from Fritz Perls is he's actually utilizing his status as, or his power dynamic, if you want to call that, as a way to highlight or elicit something from her, which is this, hey, I've got this parent-child challenge, right? I've got this issue that I had with my dad, or in my history with uh, a man or men or something like that. And he utilizes that in terms of his present relationship to elicit that, and then to work towards a treatment of that in the present context, which becomes meaningful. I would say, even in a postmodern experience, having differing dynamics allows you to draw out different things. If someone is really struggling, and this is something we always sort of consult about in our counseling programs when we're, or even in private practice when we're going to refer somebody, is you say, what do they really need versus what do they really want? And in some cases, clients may want to just feel comfortable, but maybe they need to work through different elements in order to feel more comfortable, right? So in a certain context, maybe I'm working with a female who has been raped, sexually abused, physically abused by men her whole life, right? So her working with women may feel more comfortable for her and may elicit certain things, but may also not create change that she needs long term, which is maybe in order for her to really work through her traumatic past with male relationships, because she's not going to go anywhere in the world where she's not interacting with men, right? Whether it's a work setting, or it's if it's a romantic setting, or if it's an interpersonal setting, or it's a family setting, she's going to be interacting with men. So maybe what the client needs is something along the lines of working through trauma in the context of a male relationship where she can project, where she can experience transference, where she can be triggered, if we want to use that sort of modern day language, she can be triggered into past traumatic experiences and then have the space to work through it, because psychotherapy has its boundaries and its limitations, which provide safety and security. So those would be the two things that I would sort of point to with that question. It's a really great question, and I'm sure others have had that same question along the way, but therapy isn't often just what people want. Therapy is, in its best forms and practices, is what do people really need? And therapists have to balance a little bit of both. Does that help with the question? Maybe I went totally off the rails page and wasn't really.
No, absolutely. It did help. And first of all, it immediately helped to just reframe my perspective of like, I'm looking at this as a person in 2024. Like, of course, my views on the situation, the dynamics are going to be different from how it was at that time. And it was a lot of great information. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, it's not to say that those power dynamics and that stuff didn't exist at the time. In fact, that's most of what our postmodern feminist family therapy lens is about, is understanding those types of things. But I think sometimes we sort of lose things when we view it through particular filters rather than in certain contexts of what we're trying to do or what was trying to be done at the time. So, but it's such a good question. So moving forward, right, we get these approaches that are kind of like Paige is mentioning here, right, are very much like, hey, I'm the professional, I'm going to tell you what to do. They feel very sort of forceful and move you in a particular direction. And it's, I'm the clinician and I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to pathologize, look for the issues that are going on, diagnose those. And then I know the form of treatment. And so I'm going to help you with treatment. I'm going to move you along, right? And I'm going to kind of guide and direct you and tell you, here's what's going to happen. And that's what psychotherapy is up until really this point, through Gestalt type of therapies. And then we get Carl Rogers that comes along, and Carl Rogers wants to do some differing concepts. Carl Rogers wants to assume slightly different variables when it comes to the nature of human beings, right? And one of those big pieces that you'll see is that Carl Rogers suggests that we are self-actualizing beings, in that we have sort of a propensity for growth, and we have these potentialities, and we want that. We strive and desire and are driven to do that stuff. We don't want like mediocrity, right? We want growth and development, and we may see that in just overall human development over time as an example of that, but we also may see it individually or personally in our lives that once we like settle in, we become uncomfortable. And so we're constantly sort of pushing, and we have things that make us feel comfortable, but those are probably along the lines of like behavioral therapy, like conditioning type of things. So where you sit in a classroom, for example, is probably a good one of those. You walk into a classroom and you sit down in a classroom and you sit in the one spot, and then every subsequent class you sit in that same spot, right? And what happens the day that someone comes and sits in your seat, right? What happens inside of you is like, that was my seat, when you have no ownership of that seat in particular. But that's different than, hey, I'm not feeling good, or I don't like my life the way it is. We are constantly striving for things to feel happier, to feel better, to improve our life. I mean, hey, that's why most of you taking classes, right? Is because you're trying to get better, smarter, more intellect. We go seeking for happiness and pleasure and joy. Like so much of our design, so much of marketing, look at all the commercials and advertising that's out there is all about having more fun, right? Like, hey, I've never seen a beer commercial that's really like, hey, you drink a lot of beers and you get hooked and you're addicted and now you're going to be really sad for the rest of your life because now you're going to be uh you have a propensity for alcoholism, right? Sort of idea. It's usually you're on a beach, you're enjoying sun, it's relaxing, it's around good-looking people, like these concepts that are built in of like we just want more, and so advertisers feed into that, and they know that we're trying to do that. Well, Carl Rogers took that concept and said, hey, maybe that really is meaningful. And not that he took a concept from advertisers, but he looked at human beings and said, we're constantly striving for growth in our lives, and we are seeking for stuff. Well, what gets in the way of that? Well, there's a few things that get in the way of that. Our environment and our context, like our situation, can get in the way of that. In more specifically, like our relationships. So maybe in one relationship, right, you experience things that don't allow you to be part of what you really need to feel and experience. So, case in point, a child who experiences abuse. In that direct relationship, they cannot then process abuse, right? So they need a place to go, and they need to be able to feel and experience an environment wherein they can then feel safe and comfortable, and then they can work through it, and they'll work through it themselves. And so Carl Rogers laid the groundwork for this approach of person-centered therapy, right? Really challenging the idea that the therapist knows best, and it's about therapists knowing information and then transmitting that information. But rather, it's about therapist's job is to create an environment. And we focus in on the person themselves rather than specifically the problem. And once we do that, we create the environment and we focus on the person, that those individuals will then come to a knowledge of that concept for themselves. They'll be able to work through whatever challenges or difficulties they are faced with in a really meaning or self-efficacious way is what he was doing. So his whole approach is let's foster growth promoting climates and experiences where clients really get to say, right? You come in and sit with me, and if I'm a Rogerian therapist, then I kind of sit back and I kind of watch you. And I go, where do you want to go? What do you want to talk about today? Right? Versus Freud may go, tell me about your family, or tell me about your parents, or tell me about dreams you've had, or let's do some free association work. Or Adler may have said, hey, so let's start with your siblings. Okay. Other therapists leading up to this time would have been much more directive and asking you questions. Even cognitive behavioral are going to say, Aaron Beck's going to come in with a list of questions, ask you lots of questions about what's going on with you. Rogers is going to come in and go, what do you want to talk about? What do you want to discuss? And there may be forms of free association in there, but it's more of an idea where you get to propel. You get to decide really what's happening within there. And the therapist works through various therapeutic techniques and approaches to kind of help you with an understanding of that. One of the most powerful approaches that came from Rogers, which I would love on maybe a more large societal side of things, is unconditional positive regard. Now, unconditional positive regard is sort of acceptance and genuine caring for another individual. Um, and that is accepting them as they are. Rogers always had sort of this saying, which I'll paraphrase, of like, we can't really change until we accept who we are. Now, part of our postmodern concepts of this are more along the lines of like, hey, you be you, or you accept who you are. Like, just be you, right? Carl Rogers wasn't saying that. Carl Rogers was saying, until you can accept yourself as you are, you cannot then change. So you need to be able to accept that, hey, I do struggle, or that I have this challenge, or I have this, right? Maybe our modern day lens is like, hey, that thing that is part of you, like uh oh, so if we were to take like depression as a diagnosis, for example, right? And you could take various forms of depression. All right. Our modern day example of like UBU may be more along the lines of like someone posts on TikTok, hey, I just have depression and that is me, right? Like that is a part of me, or that's part of my life. Rogers would say, okay, that's good in terms of that's the first step. Accept that it's that you have some form of depression, and that's not just you, but now we can grow. Once you accept those things and see those things as you really are, then you have a healthy sense of yourself, and now you can grow. But the problem often for us is we aren't in context or relationships where we have space to see those things. And so we need to go to therapy, because therapy helps us feel like we can start to realize and understand and see ourselves for the way that we are. That then allows us to grow. So he would use this technique of unconditional positive regard to say, hey, let's accept the clients as they presently are, because then they can start to accept themselves. And then they can start to move on. We don't need to accept behavior. That's not what we're saying, right? It's not, hey, you're an abusive spouse, so unconditional positive regard means like I'm justifying your abuse towards your partner or your spouse or towards anybody else, right? I'm not accepting that, but I'm accepting the facts. I'm accepting the things that are going on. And so what it often looks like with unconditional positive regard is we have to look at the other side of it, right? We have to look at a flip side of what's really going on for people, right? In a more extreme case, maybe that is we exercise unconditional positive regard when we get flipped off by somebody in a car, right? We're driving and someone swerves around us and then flips us off and then drives off, right? We could, in lots of contexts, go, oh, what a bleep bleep sort of concept, or we could judge that person, right? But unconditional positive regard may go, whoa, what must be going on with them, right? What kind of day must they be having to where they feel like it's important or a meaningful part of their experience to flip somebody off, right? That person is never going to come to a self-realization of what's going on if we then like drive up next to them, flip them off, or if we follow them to their end destination and get out of the car and we confront them about it, right? They're not really going to come to that. But if, say, someone in a session were with their therapist to essentially do the same, right? I've got a client that emotionally rakes me across the coals a lot, right? She's going through hard times, but then will act like I am the one who's fluctuating, or I'm the one who's abandoning her. And anytime she comes up against like a therapeutic limitation or boundary, concepts like we can't engage in a sexual relationship, right? We are not friends outside of therapy, right? And that I can't engage in caretaking behavior for them 6 other days of the week. They get me for 1 hour, 1 day a week. And when they run up against those boundaries, then they use those boundaries as a way to say, hey, you're abandoning me, right? Or you're doing this. Well, if I get defensive and guarded about that, that doesn't then allow that client to understand what's really going on for them in the present experience, and creates a bit of a lack of safety. So I sit there with the client, and I sit there in their frustration. I sit there as they sort of emotionally kind of go at me a bit and put things on me, blame things for me. I don't get defensive. I don't try and explain myself. I don't try and talk over them. I listen, ask them, engage more in their personal and emotional experience with all of that. And we sort of move forward that way. But that was kind of ideas of what Carl Rogers really brought about, right? You have to create that safety, you have to create that environment, and then people get to work through it. I would tell you, probably most therapy programs or counseling programs teach central tenets of Rogerian therapy. I would say that this is probably the most widely accepted present day therapeutic conditions or approach or assumptions that exist. In fact, if I were to sample all of you and say, hey, why don't you write down what you would want from therapy, like what it would look like, what you want it to look like. When most clients come in and I go, what do you think therapy should look like and feel like? Now, granted, I will say there is some other pieces that I should say, which is culture also plays a huge part. So across different cultures, Hispanic, Black cultures, Asian cultures, they have different approaches to what they expect out of therapy. But by and large, within a Western society like the United States, most people want something that really is reflective of Rogerian therapy. I want to be able to come in, I want to be able to share what I'm feeling. I want to feel accepted. I want sort of a genuine experience. I want to feel safe in therapy and for someone to kind of listen to me. And then I feel great in the end. And across different cultures and within an assimilation perspective as well, that will change. So maybe older, first generation Mexican Americans, right, or Mexicans, they may want something that's a little bit more directive, something that feels more medical model, white coat type of, you tell me what to do, and this is why I'm paying you, and this is why I'm coming to see you. Whereas maybe their grandchildren are going, no, I want something that feels more person-centered, something more like that, because that is part of kind of overarching culture towards mental health and therapy now. I have someone that was not necessarily that was born in Pakistan, and then now lives here in Fresno, that I used to see as a client. And they would come in and they just want to talk, right? They just want to talk. And they want to just share. And then they would be like, oh man, I feel so much better. And I would sit there for, 50 minutes. I'd reflect some stuff back to them. I'd interject and ask some questions, but it was really them directing and guiding. And it was just a place for them to come and feel like they could share, right? Which for many cultural experiences for them was really, really meaningful. And we could talk about that from a postmodernist lens, but from a Rogerian lens, most of the change and value that came for them was because they felt safe in the context of therapy, and they felt accepted, and then they could start to make changes themselves and grow subsequently. So that's really what Rogers emphasized, and what Rogers really wanted out of sort of your humanistic experience, as we see a little bit of that in there, but I won't go into humanistic theory at all today. But anyway, that's Rogers. Questions about Rogers? And don't hold back, Paige. If you have questions, feel free to ask questions. I love your questions.
I do have a question, but I was waiting to see if anyone else did first. I've noticed with some of the other therapies, like, and this is a question for like a lot of them, especially existential as well. How do you consider like an endpoint to therapy? Like, is there supposed to be an endpoint to therapy? I know with like insurance companies, they want like a treatment plan and like X amount of time. How do you consider a client graduated from like a person-centered therapy?
Great question. Great question. So up until this time, there hadn't been a lot of one, insurance companies reimbursing for therapy didn't exist. And so there wasn't really, therapy was viewed as more of a long-term concept. Sometimes for many people, it's a lifelong. The only person up until this point that really said, here are the markers for therapy progressing and being done was Freud, actually, because Freud would analyze your dreams and say, and look at your dreams and analyze those and say, over time, your dreams have improved or have changed. And so you are changing. Like I can see that that internal side is processing it different, right? For Rogers, for Gestalt, it was not necessarily about a short-term, we've got to do this sort of thing. But your question is so great because it leads us right into our next models for development, which is now we get psychotherapists who go, hey, we don't really think people should be in therapy long term or for their life, right? Carl Rogers would say, hey, therapy is done when you feel it's done and you get to fire me, right? And so we're going to work together, Paige, and we're going to interact and engage and we're going to, you're going to state what you're wanting to work on and what really your goals are and what your emphasis is. And I'm going to help you to that point. And then you get to fire me when it's there, right? But maybe what that really led to was clients never really wanted to leave therapy because they felt so good and safe. And they're like, well, I always got more to work on, which is the nature of our human condition. We always have more to work on, right? And so therapists, psychotherapists went, oh man, now we're really getting people who are staying in therapy for a really long amount of time. How can we change that? And so you get behavioral individuals or therapists who are influenced by Pavlov, Skinner, Vygotsky, that come through and go, oh, no, we can change people's behavior in a relatively short amount of time, right? We can look at Pavlov's dog experience, right? Where he got the dog to salivate in a way that it wouldn't. He got it to salivate when listening to a bell versus salivating when it saw food, right? And here's now the conditioned response, okay? We can get people to do that as well with their behaviors as well as their thoughts. And we're highly influenced by that, right? We use token economies to potty train children. If anybody's ever potty trained a child here, right? Then we do reward systems. That's what a token economy is, right? Like, oh, the moment you pee in the toilet, you go crazy on validation, and then you give them a sticker, and then they get to put a sticker on the wall, and then they build up the stickers and they get some big prize. Or the moment they pee in a toilet, right? You give them a candy or some automatic reward system so that they behaviorally associate going to the bathroom and the toilet with a positive experience, right? And it wasn't until we got to behavioralists and cognitive behavioralists where we actually get much tighter time frames for treatment, where behavioral therapists and cognitive behavioral therapists said, hey, I can name that tune in 5 beats. Maybe that's too old of a TV show for many of you, but they would say, hey, I can treat depression in 12 sessions. Whereas Rogers would say, hey, each individual may be a little bit different in their treatment of depression. So it may take 30, 40, 45 sessions. So we then get behavioralists, cognitive behavioralists that create models and standardized models for treatment. And guess who loved that? Well, emerging insurance companies loved that, right? Because now, or what they could say, and also government loved that. I'll just say that. There's a huge shift in what we started to do in terms of psychotherapy. And you see cognitive behavioral therapy that just like explodes because it uses this research model to sort of prove that it works. It can prove outcomes. Okay, well, how do you measure unconditional positive regard in a research way, right? How do you measure some of these empty chair type of approaches from Gestalt, specific techniques? That is much more difficult to operationalize in a research context. But behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy come along and go, no, we can operationalize it, we can research it, we can study it, and we can narrow down what we're doing in terms of treatment. Why would that not sound good to you? I mean, if I were to say to any of you, okay, I've got a solid approach to losing weight, right? And here's the solid approach. You exercise every day. You reduce certain food intake. I'm not going to go into specific food intake, right? But you maintain a somewhat meaningful diet, and you reduce certain things from your diet that are going to be negative for your diet and not really help your diet, right? And if you do those things in 8 to 10 months, you can get where you want to be. Or if I said, hey, I've got this great little shot thing that you stab yourself in the stomach with called Ozempic, right? And you can, and I'm not trying to knock Ozempic, but if I said, but this is like our modern day experience, right? Is Ozempic's advertised a lot. And it's like, oh, you can lose belly fat, you can lose fat by doing this. And you just kind of use this, I believe it's a diabetic drug, but you use Ozempic and you're just going to go down and you're going to lose a lot of weight. Or if I said, hey, you could go in and you could tie up your stomach and make it smaller so that you eat less, right? Or I could go in and do X, Y, and Z and you would lose weight so fast, right? And you could get what you wanted in 8 to 10 months, or you could get what you wanted in 1 month to 2 months. Which one would you choose, right? I think our modern day context is we would choose the 1 to 2 month approach over the 8 to 10 month approach, right? But the 8 to 10 month approach is saying, hey, long term, this is much more beneficial. We're really getting to the root of things. That sort of idea is what they would argue. The 1 to 2 month is saying, no, your problem is what presently exists. And so you get rid of that, and then things will change for you, right? So a behavioralist, a cognitive behavioralist would say, let's get rid of this, let's treat this. So what they started to do, produce all this research, do all these things. Insurance companies love it. The DSM really starts to come out at that time. And so the DSM and insurance companies start to go hand in hand. And cognitive behavioral therapy goes, hey, we can treat this in 8 sessions. And so insurance goes, sweet, we're going to hold you to that. We only want to reimburse X amount of dollars for insurance. And even to today, insurance is not very good in terms of psychotherapy reimbursement. Medical reimbursement, off the charts. Like, it's so great. Like there's a distinction between how medical professionals live and how mental health professionals live for lots of different reasons. Because a medical professional bills for like 4 or 5 different codes in a single visit. Mental health professionals can only bill for 1 code in a single visit, right? And then you have secondary codes, but you can't bill individually for those codes. So you're billing at 1 rate, and a doctor is billing at 5 multiple within your 30-minute experience with that doctor. So there's all these kind of issues with them. But the other thing that was loved by CBT and behavioral therapy was we can show outcomes. We can determine outcomes, which was really positive. Depression, anxiety, eating disorders, you name it, right? It's all across the board. And I think in some of those slides, I listed off all the other variables and all the other research connected to it, right? But we then get an overemphasis. Like our society loves to sort of swing a pendulum, right? In certain directions, okay? At one point, our society loved jazzercise so much, right? And then we kind of went away from that, right? Now we swing to other fads in dress or fitness or whatever it may be, right? We loved the research side of it, so much so that we infused it in everything in our society. Oh, we can behaviorally modify anything out of anybody, right? So, okay, what's a really good form of negative reinforcement? Okay, well, prison is a great form of negative reinforcement. So if anybody's struggling with X, Y, and Z, let's throw them in prison, because prison will then condition that out of them, right? And so we went into this time within like the 80s and 90s where even maybe early 2000s where like, hey, let's condition everything out of everybody, right? It was programs, right? Sobriety programs. We did this a lot. So let's take someone who's dealing with an addiction and let's throw them in a center. Let's have them get clean. Let's work on some behavioral and cognitive behavioral individual stuff. And then once they're clean and sober, let's throw them back out, right? And let's put them back out and let's send them home. Well, what happened to all the individuals that went home? Well, you could probably guess is they fell back into their addiction, right? And so then we went, oh, okay, no, we need to do more in terms of transitioning. So now we have these sort of halfway houses, transition homes. So they go and get clean and sober, and then they go to these transition homes, and then we send them back out, right? And so we created all these sort of approaches towards really everything is behavioral, cognitive behavioral emphasized. Even to today, most of our master's students who come to the program, I go, okay, well, what do you know? What do you like? Like, well, I really like cognitive behavioral. And I'm like, great, we're not going to do that in our master's program, right? Our master's program for MFCC is not about that. It's about systems and relationships. So it's about something much different, right? Not an individual, but individual psychotherapy with CBT and behavioral therapy took over and was everywhere. And that's the majority of like why we get reimbursed for things, which is great. But also creates some challenges for us present day because there's limitations, right? How many teenagers work really well with behavioral therapy approaches, right? Like when their parents try and use conditioning concepts with their teenagers, how well does that really work? I don't think it works very well because there's an added sense of cognition. So maybe a CBT approach tends to work, but maybe there's conditions in which CBT is not the right approach for individuals, or there's even been adaptations of CBT to you get IBCT, which is integrated behavioral couples therapy, which is just a offshoot of cognitive behavioral therapy, but in a relational context. And does that work well? It works with some couples. It really does. But some couples, it doesn't work. So it's not a universal, here is what really works better than everything else. But that's in the world in which we live, we try and do that, right? Oh, EMDR is the best. CBT is the best. This is the best. The EFT is the best. This is the best, right? And most of our meta-analytic studies tell us that that's not necessarily true. That the difference in those approaches is minimal comparatively. So there's other factors that sort of influence what is the best approach there. So I answered Paige's question in like a super long, drawn out, roundabout way in order to incorporate our next approaches that I just then talked about, which is CBT and behavioral therapy. So hopefully that helps, Paige, with a super long answer. I think that's my MO, is long answers. But that was great. So such a wonderful question, and it helped us transition to that. Then we get a little bit of a difference, right? Because now we're so individually focused. So across therapeutic time, we've really only focused up until this time on individuals. And how do individuals receive treatment, and how do individuals deal with things? Even couples approaches up until this time were more of the idea of two people sit in the same room, even if it's like partners sitting together, and I'm going to do individual therapy with each person. And there's no like something in between the two, right? Like the, the tractor beam or the thing that connects the two. There's nothing really there. And so these groups of psychotherapists got together in Palo Alto, right? And we have two kind of differing groups: the Milan group, the Palo Alto group. We have different names for them, but they got together, and they consisted of individuals like Jay Haley and Chloe Medanes, Steve DeShazer, Carl Whitaker, Insoo Berg. These were all very influential individuals as part of this, and they came together as a think tank and really in the beginning started studying like um, the language at the time was schizophrenia, right? Today we would probably use the language individuals with schizophrenia, right? Because we disconnect those concepts, right? We don't say that someone is autistic. We say an individual with autism. But in the time they were studying the concepts of schizophrenia within individuals and trying to give a better context to it. Because these weren't individuals where other therapeutic approaches were working super well. And so they wanted to say, is there a different way of looking at this? And so some of their early work was really about what's the relational factors that contribute to this? And, you know, and I think they would say, you know, there were certain limitations which they attributed too much to mother-child relationship, which was historically at the time was the context and the situations. You had more of this, hey, two-parent family, dad goes to work, mom stays at home, and so mom's social emotional impact on a child is much more prominent than dad's. Uh, and so dad goes to work all day, comes home, he's exhausted, mom serves him dinner, he then like chills and watches TV, and then he's really only there for disciplinary reasons, right? Like anytime the kid's acting up, then the dad comes in and he's really a disciplinarian, but mom engages in all the social emotional sides of caretaking and child rearing and all that sort of thing. So they drew some conclusions initially that were really mother-child related in terms of schizophrenia. But what later came from that was they took an adaptation of theory that had come from the hard sciences, from engineering, from other biology, chemistry, which was systems theory. And they adapted it to our social interactions and our relationships. And they said systems theory is a way for us to understand outcomes. That within any particular interaction, we may have a number of variables that then impact the outcome. And they called this, or we call this, synergy. Maybe anybody's heard of the concept of synergy, which is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if we had 5 variables, right, it's not just that we get 5, like 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 5. We would get more of the idea of 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, because it's not these are not in isolation, these concepts, but they have these interacting movements, right? So where I can then use these 5 variables to do things like grab, where I can't use a one. I mean, I'm trying to pick up my cell phone with like my one finger. Like I really can't do that. But if I use all 5 together in harmony, then I can do things like I can pick up. And that's systems theory, right? You have like lights on behind me is systems theory in engineering. And it's, I mean, I can go with my one finger and I can flip a switch, right? And I can move that switch, but my finger doesn't necessarily contain electricity and it doesn't create light. But electricity and light cannot create itself without me pushing and starting a reaction. And so there has to be the combination of my finger, a light switch, electrical wiring that then connects into some sort of power source, and then that power source has more electrical wiring that goes in and then connects to a light bulb, which then can create light. And the combination or the circuitry of all those things interacting creates light. And what we have is light. And the outcome of that is much more meaningful than just the individual pieces, right? Systems theory also says I cannot just disconnect that stuff, right? Maybe a good example, one of my mentors always like to use the idea of cake, right? Once you cake is when you make cake is you put in oil, eggs, some flour, some cocoa, depending on the cake you're making, right? You put in some leavening agent, you put in some liquid like some oil, something like that, and then you mix it up. And then you add heat to it and you bake it. Once that cake is baked, you can't then conceivably, you really can't go backwards and say, okay, well, go pull the eggs out of it. Go pull the oil out of it. Like dissect that puppy again, right? You can't do that because it's created a systemic interaction between all of them that then produces cake, right? And this was the advent of systems theory and says, there are meaningful outcomes, right? So we started to look, systems theory encouraged us to look at variables in a different way rather than, hey, so-and-so has an eating disorder. We would say, oh no, the eating disorder maybe is a functional symptomatic behavior of a system, right? That here's stuff going on within the family and what that eating disorder does, right? Functional symptomatic behavior emerges where that person then has an eating disorder. And what that does is it distracts from what's going on in the system and the system changes and focuses on that. And so maybe we started to look at eating disorders earlier on as like how do I want to say this? So like parents are fighting and arguing all the time. And then a child would engage in a behavior to distract from that. And they would take on themselves the focus and all this stuff in order to detract from like the functioning of the system. And so then we get something like negative outcome behaviors as a way to distract. So instead of just saying, hey, that kid has a problem or that person has a problem, right? We would look at the system as a whole. This could be true in terms of, it revolutionized the way in which we looked at addictions. Rather than saying, oh, that individual is an addict, we would say, oh, what are the conditions under which addiction becomes a meaningful part? And there's all kinds of really fascinating TED Talks, videos, instruction, information that you can get, some anecdotal, so be really careful, but that have pointed to the fact that it's not really, I think the language they use is it's not the rat that has the issue, because they put rats in a cage and then gave them water or gave them meth, essentially. And they're like, which one do you like better? And rats went for the meth every time. But they found out when they took those same rats and put them in like a really nice environment and put them around other rats that were friendly, where they could have rat sex all the time, where they could get on their rat wheel, where they had access to food, and it was like a warm, nice, conducive environment. And then they gave those rats the option of water versus meth. They chose water, right? And so this would be more the idea of like, hey, it's the system and it's these interactions that then lead to better outcomes within individuals particularly, right? And that you don't need quite as many of those things if you have all the conditions that you need. Jordan wrote a question. So by looking at the system, you don't assume the behavior is merely a dysfunction, but a result of coping with the environment. That is a great way to say it, Jordan. Yes, that is exactly right. Right? We get outcomes based upon the environments and the systems we're in, not necessarily just the because you as an individual have a problem specifically. So a systems therapist would look at most things as a symptom rather than the problem itself. Okay. So I want to show you an example of that. Can I show you probably one of my favorite examples of systems theory in play and how systems theory helps us understand things, right? Let me give a small description. So systems theory says we have a homeostasis. We have an environment, a static, a homeostatic state in which we like to be in. And that can be dysfunctional or functional. We can find homeostasis that revolves around abuse, addiction, or we can find homeostasis that revolves around none of that stuff. Doesn't mean homeostasis just is the level of functioning amongst system members, right? Members of a system or subsystems, that sort of thing. Doesn't mean good or bad. It means this is the way that things function and the way that things are. Well, what happens is we often find deviation from that static level, okay? So let's say that homeostasis in my family with my kids is that we laugh and joke and have fun and maybe we tease, but a deviation from homeostasis is when someone hits somebody, right? Well, we could look at it and say, okay, well, maybe they're hitting because of what is the normative homeostasis and that there's teasing, and teasing contributes to them feeling certain things, and then they feel like the only outcome is to then hit, okay? Or what's more common is we punctuate it in a systems perspective, and we look at that child and go, why did you hit, right? And then we engage in behavior to bring them back into our normative level of functioning. And so we engage in either punishing behavior or some other type of behavior in order to get them to come back to homeostasis, to where there's not hitting going on. We are uncomfortable with the deviation from that. But there may be families where they yell, and they yell a lot at each other, right? And so if someone were to go in and go, now tell me how you're feeling, right? That would also be such a variation from that would feel uncomfortable, that they would probably go back to a homeostatic response. Like, no, this is how our family functions. And every one of your families is like that, okay? We see that in really interesting ways. If you've ever left your home for like college, or left to go and live somewhere for like 6 months, and then you go back, what you'll notice is, and here's what happens to a lot of college students, is they'll go off to college, not live with family or parents and not see them, whatever. They will go off to college for some time. They'll start to develop new traits, new characteristics, new ways of being, that sort of thing, right? And they may love that. They may go, this is really who I am, and I've figured out who I am, and I feel comfortable, and I like this. And then what happens is they go back home, and there's a homeostasis in their home of this is how we function, this is how we interact. And so they lose a lot of those traits, right? We call those emergent, submergent properties, but they lose a lot of those traits, and they come home and they find themselves falling into the same things that they did as a teenager who lived at home. And they're treated the same way as a teenager, right? In my family, I am number 6 out of 7, okay? I also have a PhD. I've also been practicing therapy for almost 15 years and have lots of knowledge and experience. But you wouldn't know that when I go and interact with my siblings, right? At least early on in the process, 5, 6 years ago, I am still little brother. I am still the, hey, you're annoying little brother. You got to make jokes, and you got to be really funny, and you got to be this and that and that and this, right? And that's not anything somebody says to me overtly, but that's something that we fall into in terms of homeostasis within particular systems, okay? And that's where we can have lots of challenges or problems, okay? But every system has a response. We call these feedback loops. Feedback loops are the ways in which we either get back to homeostasis or in which we start to change the system, right? So we call these negative and positive. Don't take those as like valuative judgments. They're also called attenuating or amplifying systems, right? Or and so what that means is negative or attenuating means we want to get back to where we were, right? So something new comes into the family. Oh, here comes someone's getting married, and here comes an in-law that's coming in. Nope, we want to function the way we want to function, and this is how we function. And it's uncomfortable for this new in-law to come because they don't know all the rules and don't know all the functionality of how we work as a family and all this stuff. And so we kind of like treat them poorly or keep them at a distance or something like that, right? And so we kind of attenuate a little bit. Or if a kid in a family goes, hey, I've got a problem, and they come out about their problem, right? I've got an addiction, I've got this, I've got that, or even they come out, right? We've seen this in recent decades of like someone, someone from the LGBTQ community comes out and says, hey, I am gay, right? And a family goes, whoa, attenuate, right? Let's attenuate. We don't know how to handle this. We don't know what to do with it. Let's attenuate. Let's get back to the way we are. Okay. And even nowadays, it may be like, oh, okay, you're gay, but we're still going to be the same way we once were, right? Like we're going to still function the same way we once were, which doesn't really work. If systems attenuate too much and too fast and too often, they tend to break down because they're too restricted. Systems are meant to change and grow and develop. And so with that, we get amplification. Amplification loops allow for growth to happen, but ultimately go back to attenuating, right? So here comes an amplification, which stretches the system, but then we don't feel comfortable with it, so we attenuate. Real growth within systems is not fast. It's slow, methodical over time, where we have a process of attenuation, amplification, but we never go back to the original attenuation, right? And we just build and build and build. So that's kind of how systems function. Now, that may be a lot of really theoretical explanation of that. It may be a bit abstract. So I'm going to share with you a video to highlight some of this. And I may pause the video periodically to say, here's what we're seeing. But perhaps one of the best places to see really systems is within a high school, right? You go to high school and there's all these subgroups, or we would call them subsystems within high school. Anybody think of any subsystems that exist in high school?
There's sports teams.
Sports, or in my day, we call them jocks, right? Like these were the jocks, right? What other subsystems exist? If anybody seen Mean Girls, maybe we'd call them the plastics. Maybe there's the plastics exist, right? This isn't us labeling anybody, but sometimes you see skaters, right? Or you see the stoners, or you see the nerds, or you see like all these different subgroups, right? Well, every subsystem has rules for that subsystem, correct? Right? How you act, how you dress. Don't you notice that they all start to dress the same, right? If you've been across like Fresno State campus, it's probably not hard to pick out like sometimes who the athletes are because they all wear athletic apparel, right? They get free clothes from who is it? Who's our provider for Fresno State? It's not Nike. I don't know who it is, but they get athletic gear and so they wear it, right? And it's a part of their culture. It's part of who they are, part of like all that stuff. And so they dress very similar. When in my undergraduate, it was pretty funny because I had a friend who was in engineering, and you go in the engineering building and they all dress very, very similar, right? And then you come over to my field and it was more the humanities and social sciences and stuff. And he would come in dressed what was normative for engineering and come in and he'd be like, wow, people dress so different over here, right? Like it was different trends, different fads, like different experimentation with dressing and that sort of thing. And he's like, wow, these people dress just so different. And we do that. We take on our jerseys of sorts, our uniforms within groups of how we sort of dress and act. And so these subsystems have ways of acting and being. So I'm going to show you a clip of some high school students, and you're going to watch in these subsystems, and what you're going to see is an individual within that subsystem is going to want to do something that amplifies that homeostasis, that is outside the realm of what is normally accepted within that subsystem. And then you're going to see what the response is, right? And we get to see systems in play here, or an analysis of systems here. So that's what we're going to watch for a second. Anybody ever seen the movie High School Musical? Yes? Okay, good. This is from High School Musical, which is so fun to show when I'm doing a class. This is great. So let me, let's go. Oops, let me do this first. I want to go to present. So it blows up the screen a bit. Why am I missing it? All right, now that's nice and big. Yes? Okay. So here we go. I'm gonna hit play. For those who haven't seen High School Musical, there is, this is all singing, so it's meant to be a little funny. It's okay if you laugh a little bit at like some of the funny stuff in here, or what seems peculiar. But there is a couple, Troy and Gabriella, that one is a jock basketball player and one is more of a academic nerd type of individual, but both have musical talents. And so they go and try out for a musical, and they've just gotten notice that they've been invited for callbacks. Sharpay Evans, who is the person on the screen currently, has been the lead in all the dramas and musicals and stuff. And so she is not okay with them changing. But what we're going to see is a ripple effect of Gabriella and not Zac Efron. It is Zac Efron. But we're going to see Troy and Gabriella. We're going to see a ripple effect of others who look at their example and go, oh, now I've got something else that I'm passionate about that I like. And they're going to try and share it with their subsystems. So watch as you and take in all the goodness that happens here. And we'll pause periodically. Here we go. Just as a small aside, the guy that's in the plaid and that guy right there in the plaid with the hair, he is in Hamilton. He's in the original cast of Hamilton. He's the British soldier that stands up and sings, "Heed not the rebels, they scream revolution, they have not your interest at heart." That's him. Anyway, not that you wanted that small aside. But what are you seeing? So this is helping us understand systems theory. So we get individuals that are approaching their subsystem. They're going, hey, I've got something that's different than what fits within this subsystem. And they're like, and I want to share it. What's the response?
The response is negative. They're saying, don't do that. Do what you're supposed to do. Do homework. Don't do hip hop.
Good. So that's the second response page, which I was hoping I would trick people, right? So the second response is attenuation, right? The first response is actually amplification, right? The first response is, oh yeah, dig down deep, right? Tell us what's going on. You're in your subsystem. It's safe. Like share with us, right? And this is actually how most systems function. Is in the beginning, we are open to something being shared. But the moment that it deviates from what our normal cycle is, or what our normal assumptions or normal like homeostatic state is, right? Then we get what you just described really well, Paige, right? Which is, no, 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 this isn't going to work. Like, cut it out. Like, that doesn't fit. Is that even legal? Right? And which is my favorite kind of corny line there, right? Is that even legal? Right? We use so many different approaches to go, no, come back in, right? Like that's not part of how this system functions. So let's come back, right? And we're going to see that. Now, if we continue to get lots of amplification with no attenuation, then the system goes into chaos. So let's see if we can see that happen. You'll get one more example of sort of amplification, attenuation, and then you're going to get lots of amplification because everybody's just going to start doing all these things that don't fit within their subsystem or within that homeostatic state of their subsystem. So here we go. Watch and see if you can see the chaos. I think that is shared well enough, right? So hopefully that example helps you understand systems theory just a little bit, right? Some meaningful parts, right? We function within systems, we act within systems, and then we can reject concepts from systems. Now, in many cases, people go, oh, well, what's so wrong with breaking down systems, right? But homeostatic states are also where growth and development happens and occurs, and it's not always such a negative experience, right? But systems theory was a way to understand people within a relational context on a greater level than what we had previously understood it. And so if we just met with Gabriella in therapy, we may not understand the bigger context of what's really happening. Now, hopefully most of you are going to have that song stuck in your head the rest of the day. And just kidding. But if you decide to go watch High School Musical, what you can watch and break down theoretically is, okay, here is how they work through that and essentially change the system over time to where it's not Gabrielle has to choose between one or the other, and that there can't be somewhat of acceptance within that system. Their systems can change and grow, but it takes work to do. And that's what they sort of demonstrate throughout the movie. So I take all the fun out of movies when I watch them. I come to understand that. So anyway, that's we've covered quite a few theories, right? So Gestalt, person-centered, behavioral, cognitive behavioral, and now systems. And I know systems is something you probably weren't introduced to until this week, unless you've been moving ahead on modules. But I thought I would give you sort of an introduction as a way to go see it. So maybe you can approach it in a slightly different way this week. But we are right there at time, 11:30. So I'll hang tight for anybody who wants to have questions. And anybody else who needs to go, you can go. And I appreciate you being here. Make sure you get all your stuff in by midnight. But I'll hang for a few minutes to answer any questions that anybody may have.
I have a quick administrative question. I wasn't able to find the live lecture from January 2nd on Canvas.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let me take care of that. Well, wait, January 2nd, that's the one I had to cancel, right?
Yeah, but I think you said you were going to upload something and I couldn't
Yeah.
find anything.
So I didn't end up doing that. I incorporated all those pieces into today.
Today.
So yeah, we would have normally gone just probably about an hour today and covered a little bit less, but I incorporated Gestalt and person-centered into that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, have a good rest of your week. Good luck with getting all those modules completed and get them turned in. Send me an email if you have any questions. Take care, everybody.